Good morning, everybody. I think you're all on mute.
Good morning, Amanda.
Hey, how you doing?
I'm doing good. This is T. Brown.
Awesome. Hey, thanks for tuning in. Who else do we have here? Margaret.
I'm Margaret Mulqueen. I'm a new agent at the Lake Country Keller Williams office. I'm so excited to be here. I'm also a full-time high school teacher, so a little fun going on right now.
Well, welcome. Thanks for coming.
Tell the new agent that just spoke, the high school teacher, hey, I'm a high school teacher as well, but I'm retiring. This is Teresa Brown talking.
Thank you, Teresa. I appreciate that. This is Margaret. We'll have to chat later and discuss what you teach and all the wonderful transitions from teaching to real estate. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yes, ma'am, Margaret. Pleased to meet you.
Thank you.
Awesome. And we've got one other person. I'm not sure who it is based on your the name that's showing up. Who else is here? Perhaps somebody who is signed on but not, or just on mute. All right, well, if you don't already have this pulled up on your computer or on a piece of paper in front of you, what we're reviewing today is the second half of the offer to purchase. And just as a reminder, and Margaret, for you being newer, what we're doing in the North Shore office is, as part of our productivity and launch program, is we have what we're calling our top 5. And they're 5 things that are the key to being ready to rock as a real estate agent, basically. So it's the offer to purchase. So making sure that you have that practiced and written more than one offer as a practice offer, and just really feel familiar and comfortable and confident about what's in that document. It's also having a buyer consultation ready. So whether that's just an outline of conversation that you have with a buyer before they are out there looking at homes with you and writing an offer, or additionally having a packet or some bits of information that you can give them on paper or digitally, and also including buyer agency agreement and understanding that as well. The third item in your top 5 is a listing presentation. So having the outline of that conversation, the packet that you would provide, which is quite different from the buyer packet, and also having a CMA, or comparative market analysis, put together. So doing a practice one of those is also excellent. The fourth item in your top 5 is having a listing contract down. So practicing that, going through it, feeling confident and comfortable in that. And the fifth item of the top 5 is to have 100 contacts in command. So not just having names put in there, but also having some information about those people, phone number, email address, ideally address as well, and making some contacts with those people as well, starting to build out your groups, and having that great database to work from, which right now is really important. So those are your top 5 to focus on, and what we think are really the keys to being ready to rock, confident and prepared as a new agent. And you'll be doing business while those 5 are being put together, but ideally you've got a really good handle on that stuff, and that's what's really going to propel your business, because you'll be ready, you'll have those things put together. You won't have to practice on your clients, which we really don't want you to do. So you're really well prepared and ready to do a great job. So those are the top 5. And as part of those, we thought it would be helpful to go through an offer to purchase. So last week, and this is on the YouTube channel. How is everyone subscribed to the YouTube channel? You can give a wave if you are. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. It's awesome. It has all of our, any of our education events that have been happening digitally, they're on there. It's an excellent resource. It's a private group for Keller Williams, for our offices. So really great resource. Definitely take a look at that and subscribe if you haven't. It's really great. But the first half of the offer is there from last week that I went over. And so today we're going to go through the second half. And I'm hoping I'll have a little time at the end. If not, I'd love to check in with you and just kind of see how your top 5 are going and what you're doing to work through this unusual time and kind of make the most of it, because there's a lot of opportunity here. And now that we're kind of settling into the new norm, this is a really good time to just, find the best way to handle what's going on and do what you can to support other people and come from a place of giving. So I'm just pulling up the offer here. I will tell you, if you didn't go to the meeting this morning or watch the meeting this morning, we are very much still in an active market. The inventory is looking more like November, December, so it's not quite the robust inventory we see in the spring. However, activity is still there. A lot of people are in the mindset that everything's shut down and everything has slowed down, and there's not much happening, but in fact, there's quite a bit of business, and people who are out there to buy are serious buyers, and offers are still coming in very quickly, within a couple of days and over asking price in many cases, just across the 5-county area. So don't let anybody tell you business is not happening. It's still happening. It's happening at a little bit slower pace, and there's less inventory and a less of the people who are just kind of looky-loos that pop up in the spring who are thinking about buying a home. Right now it's more serious buyers, but they're out there and they're active. So I had a new listing go up last week. It was a lower price kind of entry-level home at 116. We had 12 showings in the first 2 days, and we have an accepted offer. So it's still happening. So stay in your A game, stay on top of your whatever one of your top 5 you're going to focus on this week, and set aside that block of time to work on it and stick to it. So getting into the offer. So we stopped at page 5. Just anybody who went through after we looked at it last week that had any last insights or questions on that? Anybody? I'm hearing somebody like doing dishes or something, so don't have something to share, you might want to go on mute. All right, so people are feeling good about it, or you have a question? Is that Elizabeth?
Yes. Hi.
Hey.
So in productivity training, they actually were talking a lot about offers, and I mentioned how that conversation, because Janine is more of like a listing side, and I know you do both, but I really like the buyer side, and she much prefers the listing side. So it was really interesting how both conversations happening in 1 week sort of like they overlapped, and I mentioned it and she's like, oh, that's fantastic. She's like, I'm really glad. I hope everybody's having this experience. So it was super cool.
Yeah, I watched that on the YouTube channel after the class happened on Thursday. And again, if you're just joining us, please subscribe to the YouTube channel. There's so much excellent content there. That's a great way to catch up and go back and re-listen to things. But I listened to that and I agree. I think there was some good overlap, and it's great to get different perspectives, right? I'm going through, and some of these details are just matter of fact what they are. And some of them are going to be insight based on my experience. And so Janine's perspective is different, and any other agent, whether they're launch program coaches or team leaders or experienced agents, newer agents, we're all coming from a little bit different experience. So what I'm hoping to share with you is what's typical and common that I'm seeing in the marketplace, working in all 5 counties on a very regular basis, but I've got a different perspective. So, take what I'm sharing with you as a good jumping off point and continue to investigate, read through that offer yourself and get some other perspectives on it to kind of develop your point of view. So that's a really good point. And you'll definitely see overlap. I think we all come from a similar place. And ultimately, we're just wanting to be really professional and well informed and representing our clients the best way we can. So that's a great point. Anybody else with any insight from the first half from last week, or having looked through the offer before coming to class today.
I have a question.
Yeah.
For things that have to do with the inspections and contingencies and stuff like that, on line 194, do you only check that if you have something specific?
194. So referring to the inspection contingency.
Yes.
So that would be included if your buyer wants to have a home inspection. And that's the general overview home inspection. So if they're like, yes, I want an inspection, which typically I would say is a good idea. When it comes to kind of covering everybody's butts, that's the best way to go. It's very rare that I won't have an offer with an inspection on it. And when that happens, it's usually a really well-informed buyer or an investor who's like, I know the house is a mess, I'm going to take care of everything, so I'm not worried about an inspection. Or possibly a condo where there's very limited responsibility. Other than that, it's pretty rare that there won't be a home inspection. It's a big mic drop to not have a home inspection on your offer. And it is a risk. So if you have a buyer considering not having a home inspection, I would just make sure that you clearly explain that that is a risk, that there may be things that come up that are going to be an expense or repair that will be their responsibility. And that, you know, it's obviously very appealing to a seller, but they have to weigh out the risk to themselves as well. So just something important to talk about with them rather than them just saying like, I don't think I need a home inspection and going, okay, and just moving on in the offer, because that's a really important piece and could end up costing them a lot later. And really it's when you're in the conversation of writing the offer, it's harder for a buyer to picture like, what does that mean down the line? So that's another reason it's really good to talk about this stuff before you're writing an offer.
Right. It'd pay a few $100s for the inspection, but maybe save you some heartache down the road.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
And
So
very
then
often worthwhile.
So then on 198 is that I have just scribbled in there is something that if we specifically see something, like if we specifically maybe saw mold in the basement that we want to highlight. Okay.
Yeah. And that you could approach that in two ways. It's fairly uncommon in my experience for anything to be written in there. If anything, I often see agents write entire property or whatever the inspector recommends, and both of those are incorrect use of that space. It automatically says that if the inspector recommends follow-up, that you can have those inspections, so you don't need to put that in there. And the inspection itself is the entire premises, so it's just redundant and it looks like you don't know how to use an offer. So I recommend not doing that. But if there's something specific, you could wait to see what the inspector says and then bring in that expert. If your buyer's really adamant that inspection is done right away, you could write it in, but it will be a red flag to the seller. So it's weighing how to best utilize the timing of that, and also how much time you're giving for the inspection contingency to allow time for those added investigations of experts.
Correct. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, so I'm going to jump right into page 5. So we're on page 5 of 10 of the offer. The top of the page is the radon testing contingency. This was part of the update to the offer that came out last year, actually starting January 1. And that is a contingency that was part of testing noted in the addendum A, which is the added document to the offer that you should generally be using to include other contingencies. It's already written out for you. You don't have to worry about it being enforceable or having the proper language. It's already there. The thing that I usually will tell buyers is when I first meet with them in a buyer consultation, I make sure they have a link to information about radon and what that means. So I don't serve as the expert about radon. I just give them that as a link, and I can add that to the comments in the Facebook group later. But what I usually tell them is radon testing does cost additional. So it's usually around $175, and it's something that the inspection company would offer. In order to do any testing, we have to have seller's permission, so it would have to be a part of the offer. In general, what a radon test that is bad means is that there's mitigation required, and mitigation usually costs around $1,000. It's in the like $800 to $1,200 range is what I usually see. So if they're concerned about radon and they cannot take on the cost of mitigation themselves, it's a good thing to include in their offer. And it's set up much like the inspection contingency, where there's a time frame and you can give the seller the right to cure or not. Radon being high is considered a major defect. It's a health and safety issue, and it has its own contingency built around that. So if that is the case, it's good to include. It is fairly common to include. However, when you're in competition, it's one of those things that maybe your buyer wouldn't want to include. It's one less hurdle for the seller. And when it comes to radon testing, the seller is the one living in the home when it's being tested during the purchase. So we're trusting that they're not opening all the windows or opening and closing doors or messing with the test. But we don't know that for sure. And the testing is only done once. And oftentimes what I've learned from radon testers is that it's worth doing more than once, because you may get different readings. So, you know, knowing that the neighbor has high radon doesn't necessarily mean that your house does, or vice versa, or it doesn't mean that you don't if they don't. So it's worth testing and it's worth looking into. But I would say in terms of putting it into an offer, it's one more hurdle for the seller that they might not like, and you're only testing once. Whereas if they want a more thorough investigation, they may want to test after they own the house. And they can do that. They can have somebody come in, they can get a test from the hardware store. There's a number of ways to do that. So it's not like this is their only opportunity. So I just want to make sure that they understand that clearly, that it's not the only chance. And this is a lot to talk about. So again, something good to discuss before you're writing an offer. Right to cure with that, like I said, very much like the inspection contingency. So it's only going to affect once the notice of defects is issued. Otherwise, if the radon comes in high, over 4 picocuries is the measurement of radon. And if that happens, we can go back to the seller and ask them to install a mitigation system. But if they said no, we could issue a notice of defects. Or if it came in high and the buyer was just not wanting to move forward, even with mitigation, it would be probably an emotional decision if they wanted to go that route. So it's good to give them a moment to get perspective on the situation. But if that did happen, issuing a notice of defects is what triggers the right to cure. And then the seller could decide to cure by having a mitigation system installed, or they could opt not to, and then the deal would end. So you wouldn't go to closing. So it's good for them to understand how that would work. Next is financing commitment contingency. So anybody who has a loan for a property uses the financing commitment contingency in their best
Amanda,
interest. Yes.
really quick, what is your online 234? What is your length of time for your radon?
For radon, I oftentimes just match that to inspection time frame. So if the inspection, you know, if you pick 12 days, somewhere between 10 and 15 is most common. So if you pick 12 days, if you pick 13 days, I usually just do the same for radon.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Since the test is done by the inspector, kind of falls into the same time frame. Good question. So with financing, it again is in your buyer's best interest to have this contingency if they have a loan. And really it would be very, I wouldn't recommend not putting it in if they do have a loan. You've got to be forthright with the seller that you're working with a financing situation. If they have cash, you would not use this. And that's like, I am paying cash, I am wiring cash to pay for this property entirely. So if they have a loan, use the financing commitment contingency. So you would check that box at line 249. And then this is when it's good to have the pre-approval letter in hand to reference, and you may need to talk to the lender. So check that pre-approval as soon as you get it, and make sure that it says the purchase amount and there's some indication of the down payment amount, whether it's the percentage or it says, you know, they can purchase up to this dollar amount, but the loan will be for this dollar amount. Then you kind of know what the down payment is. They'll have an interest rate on there sometimes, but that does not get locked in until you have an accepted offer. So it's only an estimate and can change prior to them locking in. So that's one piece to have in front of you, is the pre-approval to reference for the financing commitment contingency. The other thing to have on hand is a mortgage calculator. You're going to have to do a little math. Some of the lenders do that in their pre-approval letter. Many of them don't. So again, this is something to talk about with your buyer before you're writing an offer, especially the piece about the interest rate. Many people are really excited about the low interest rates right now. We did see a bit of a jump over the last couple weeks with lenders, in some cases inflating their own interest rates to slow down business because they had too many refinances and new buyers at the same time. They were overloaded. And so in some cases, there were lenders, credit unions, et cetera, that were increasing their interest rates. That can be very upsetting to a buyer if they're counting on that low interest rate. So this is something to discuss ahead of time, but at the very least, when you're putting this together. So the first section here, the offer is contingent upon buyer being able to obtain a written blank. That's where you would put the type of loan. So conventional, FHA, VA are the most common. If your buyer has the option of conventional versus FHA, conventional is more appealing to a seller. The reason being, FHA and VA do require that when the appraiser comes through, they're doing an additional kind of overview inspection. So they're looking for mainly health and safety concerns or any obvious problems that are going to cost the buyer money. So if you have peeling paint, that's a big one for FHA. If you have missing handrails along the stairs, that's very common. If you have a very obvious bad roof, like it's curling, it's peeling, it's disintegrating, those sorts of things they're looking for. If there's water in the basement, they walk downstairs and the basement's full of water, that's a problem. So FHA still can be used for a lot of homes, but it's not going to work for every home. So before you're writing an offer, you know, that's why it's good to get that pre-approval sooner than later, very shortly after you have your buyer consultation or even before. It's good to know what financing they're working with, because if you have an FHA buyer and you're showing them properties that all have peeling paint and other issues that are going to come up with an inspection for that loan, writing an offer isn't going to get you very far. The seller's agent, the listing agent should be aware of what those issues are, and they're probably going to advise their seller to not accept an offer with an FHA loan if they know they have FHA issues, because that stuff has to be fixed before the loan commitment will be issued. So this seller will know right away, oh, I know what problems are going to come up in FHA, or I have an idea, and I know this is going to cost me time and money right off the bat, or I'm not sure, but there's the potential for another thing that's going to require me to do something or pay for something prior to closing. So they don't love it. It's something to keep in mind. That also can be an issue with condos. Right now you have to have, your condo association has to be approved for FHA and or VA, and that's not always the case, because conventional loans have changed in the last few years to where you can have a very low down payment, 3.5%. And before that was the draw for FHA loans. Now it's more a matter of like credit score and debt to income ratio, things like that. So whatever your buyer is putting in there, keep in mind if this will make sense with this property. So that line 250, you're going to put conventional or FHA or VA. You might even have an adjustable rate mortgage, 15-year, but that's still going to be a conventional. So next line 251. So it goes conventional loan, first mortgage loan commitment as described below within blank days. Now, again, excellent thing to do ahead of time is to communicate with the lender. You can talk to your buyers and say, you know, do you know the time frame they gave you? Do you know the down payment you're required to have or what you're comfortable with? But it's not a bad idea to also communicate with the lender directly. I usually ask my buyers if that's okay, or I'll even include them in an email. So I'll copy the buyers right in there, email the lender and say, hey, I saw you have a pre-approval with so-and-so. I'm the agent working with them. And before you even write an offer, you can say, just wanted to check in and see, you know, what things are looking like right now in terms of your interest rates and the time it takes to get a loan commitment and to close. Like, what are the best time frames for those? Because you're going to need that information when you're writing the offer. So, and if you haven't done it for a while, you did that, you know, 30 days ago, it might be good to check in again. If you're going out on showings, there's a good chance you're going to be writing an offer. Because if you put in too short amount of time, you won't be able to get the loan commitment in time, and you're going to have to get the seller to agree to push it back. And that's annoying. So just be prepared, be professional. So typically within 30 days on the short end and 45 on the long end. That's pretty common. So loan commitment, line 251, within usually 30, 35 is what I often put in there. Could be as long as 45, but most lenders can pull off the 30 or 35 time frame. Just make sure they can. And tell the listing agent when you send in the offer, hey, just so you know, I realize it's a little bit of a shorter time frame, but I already checked with the lender and we're good. That's just going to make them feel a lot better, and it makes you look more prepared and on top of things. The financing selected shall be in the amount of not less than blank. That dollar amount is the loan amount after down payment. So look at your purchase price amount, talk to your buyers about what their down payment is, make sure that matches what the lender requires, and then put that in. Now, if your buyer decides, okay, I'm gonna say in my offer, I wanna put 10% down, but I might be putting 15% down, I'm just not sure yet, that's okay. What this is designed to do is to protect the buyer. So if they say, I'm going to put 10% down, and they decide later to do 15, fabulous, that's okay. If they say they're gonna put 10% down, and then later they can only put 5% down, something happened financially, or the lender comes back to them and says, you have to put 15% down or you can't get your loan, and they can't make that happen, that's when this comes into effect. You can then say, shoot, my buyer can't get the loan that they thought they could with their bank, and because of that, they have to get out of the contract. And then you can write a notice to get them out of the contract within the time frame of that 30 or 35 days, whatever you put in there. Now, if all goes well, let's get through the rest of this. So for a term of not less than, it's very typically 30 years, but that information should be in the loan or the pre-approval. And amortized over not less than blank years, which is very often 30 years. A 30-year fixed rate loan is pretty common, but it may be different. So it's good to check and just confirm that with the lender. Initial monthly payments of principal and interest shall not exceed. So if you're using a mortgage calculator for a line 256, for line 253, I need my glasses. When you're filling that in, you're looking purely at principal and interest. So this does not include taxes, insurance, private mortgage insurance, condo fees. It does not include any of that. It's just principal and interest. So when you're using that mortgage calculator to fill this out, or maybe it's in the pre-approval, make sure that you've got the right number there. And make sure you explain that to your buyer. This is only principal and interest. This doesn't include taxes, private mortgage insurance, condo fees, HOA dues, etc. So that number is what goes in there. So if for some reason that payment goes up, they could go back to the seller and say, I can't get the loan that I was expecting. Buyer acknowledges lender's required monthly payments may also include 1/12 of the estimated net annual real estate taxes, hazard insurance premiums, i.e. homeowners insurance, and private mortgage insurance premiums. The mortgage shall not include a prepayment premium. Buyer agrees to pay discount points in the amount of, it's really typical that that's 0. If you know for sure they are only wanting this loan if they can buy down points, and what that means is pay money up front to have a lower interest rate, then make sure that's in there. Otherwise, it's very commonly 0. If the buyer is using multiple loan sources or obtaining a construction loan or land contract financing described in the lines below, or an addendum attached per line 563, buyer agrees to pay all customary loan and closing costs, wire fees, and loan origination fees, to promptly apply for a mortgage loan and to provide evidence of application promptly upon request of the seller. Seller agrees to allow lender's appraiser access to the property. So that's built in there as well. The lender requires an appraisal to ensure that the property is at least worth what they're lending the buyer after down payment. If the purchase price under this offer, I'm on line 261, is modified, any financed amount, unless otherwise provided, shall be adjusted to the same percentage of the purchase price as in the contingency. The monthly payments shall be adjusted as necessary. What that means is if you write this offer, you fill out this whole contingency, you get a counter offer for a different purchase price, you don't have to redo this contingency. It's all going to adjust in the same percentages with the new purchase price. So keep that in mind. You don't have to worry about adjusting this if the price changes, even once you have an accepted offer. If you have to drop the price for some reason or make an adjustment, don't worry, this is set up to adjust automatically. Line 264, check and complete applicable financing provision. So if this is fixed rate financing, which is most common, again, good to check with the lender ahead of time. Then line 265 is the box you would check, and then you would fill in an interest rate. Now, what goes here is not necessarily what the interest rate is today with that lender. Interest rates can fluctuate a little bit, and so it's a good idea to give a little bit of wiggle room. This is very important to confirm with your buyer. So if they right now are expecting their interest rate to be 3.85%, but there's a chance it might fluctuate a little bit between now and the time they lock in their interest rate, then it's a good idea to give yourself a little bubble. So if they're expecting 3.85, I might put 4.25 or 4.1, something like that. Make sure they're comfortable with it, and even run your numbers for the above section of the commitment with that interest rate. So when you're running a mortgage calculator to figure out that principal and interest payment for line 263, put in whatever interest rate you're using on line 265. You want a little wiggle room because an educated listing agent is going to look at that, and if it's too low, they will have concerns, and their seller will not be too keen on agreeing to an interest rate that is unlikely. So just make sure that's high enough that it allows a little bubble, but also make sure your buyer is comfortable with that number. If it's adjustable rate, you'd fill in accordingly. Here's the big one: satisfaction of financing commitment contingency. Is there ever an opportunity, to your knowledge, for the seller to walk away from an offer without breaching contract? Anybody? Anybody?
Good night, guys.
So there are very few. Buyers oftentimes are nervous about a seller just walking away. Make sure they understand they are in the driver's seat as the buyer. The buyer has contingencies or doors out, opportunities to utilize the contract, to walk away from the transaction and have a right to their earnest money back if they're using those contingencies properly. The seller, however, very rarely has the opportunity to say, I'm out of here. They can say no. They can say no to things like repairs and inspection, adjusting a price based on the appraisal, but they have very few opportunities to actually walk away using the contract. This is one of them. The loan commitment is a hugely important due date. Hugely important. Absolutely make sure you know when this is due and keep in touch with the lender and buyer to make sure that this loan commitment is happening. If that is late, the seller could walk away. Now, that far into the contract, will they? Maybe not necessarily, but if they're looking for a door out, this could be a very clean exit for them. So make sure you're advocating for your buyer and including and making sure that the deadlines are lining up, that you've got enough time and that things are moving along to get you to loan commitment in time. If you don't, then, well, I'll read what could happen. So if the buyer qualifies for the loan described in the offer, they agree to deliver to the seller a copy of the written loan commitment. The way that's written now, you don't have to include a notice that the contingency is satisfied. You can, it's not a bad practice, but at the very least, the buyers need to sign the loan commitment letter before you send it over to the listing agent. So make sure you look at that. Make sure you tell them that they should send you a copy once they have it. Usually a lender won't send it to you directly. So if you've had the appraisal, you've gotten the report back, you should be expecting the loan commitment soon. And so check in with the lender and with the buyer and just say, buyers, could you please forward a copy to me once you have it? Make sure you look at that copy. It may have some contingencies in it. And if there's anything in there that needs to be figured out, make sure that that's getting clearance before you send this over. There's going to be some stuff that's standard, like confirming their employment before closing or day of closing. They're getting homeowners insurance, some stuff that is standard. But if there's anything funky in there, and if you're not sure, talk to the lender, just to make sure you're not turning this in while they still have some contingencies outstanding. But it's got to be in by the due date, and they have to have signed it. Send it to the listing agent. Make sure you confirm they received it, because this is a really big point in the transaction where the seller could walk away if you don't turn it in on time. The contingency shall be satisfied after the buyer's review. Buyer delivers to seller a copy of the written loan commitment, even if subject to conditions, that is, A, signed by the buyer, or accompanied by buyer's written direction for delivery. So just make sure you're including that. You're not just forwarding it without looking at it or without having it signed. The seller's termination rights at line 282. So above that, the delivered loan commitment may contain conditions buyer must yet satisfy to obligate the lender to provide the loan. Buyer understands delivery of a loan commitment removes the financing commitment contingency from the offer and shifts the risk to buyer if the loan is not funded. So again, just make sure you're reading that, clearing up any contingencies to that before you send it in. Seller termination rights. If the buyer does not deliver a loan commitment on or before the deadline, on line 251, the seller may terminate the offer. If seller delivers written notice of termination to the buyer prior to the seller's actual receipt of the written loan commitment from the buyer. So again, just make sure you turn that in on time. If the financing commitment is not available on the terms stated in the offer, again, that's why it's there to protect your buyer. If it's not going to be available in the way they expected or they're okay with, then that's a way they can walk away from the contract. Now, if they think they still want to move forward with the house and they couldn't get what they wanted with this lender, you might be able to scramble and get a loan with a different lender at a different interest rate or who knows what. There may be some other solutions to that, but kind of on the cut and dry side, that's how it would go. Line 289, page 6. So seller financing, not very common these days. So typically that's an NA in that box. The appraisal contingency in line 310. Here's another one that's a little confusing and that not every agent understands. So use it thoughtfully. Appraisal contingency is very common. Buyers like to have it. It's understandable from a seller's standpoint. However, there's a little more to it than that. If you have financing, an appraisal will be ordered. However, the appraisal number that the lender cares about is the amount of the loan. In some cases, it's going to be a little bit over that to make sure that the down payment is a certain percentage. So always keep in touch with the lender about that. But in general, you're looking at the loan amount after down payment. Now, if your buyer has a pretty significant down payment, this appraisal contingency is even more important. Say their loan is for $200,000, but the house is $250,000. If it appraises for $200,000 and you don't have an appraisal contingency, they're moving forward 50 grand short in equity. So the appraisal contingency is looking at the purchase price. Now there's more nuance to that. There's some other things that may come into play on the lender's side of things, but regardless, an appraisal happens. The report is used for both the loan commitment as well as the appraisal contingency. It's the same report. They only pay for it once, but the appraisal contingency looks purely at the purchase price. So this is an important piece. You can strategically remove it, but it's very important the buyer understands those risks. If the appraisal comes back under purchase price, but at a number that satisfies the lender, they're moving forward and have no opportunity to renegotiate. If it comes in low and they have an appraisal contingency, say that 200, 250 example, it's a 250 purchase, but it appraises for 235. You then can go back to the seller, provide them the appraisal report as proof, and renegotiate the price. Oftentimes that's a give and take. Oftentimes you're meeting somewhere in the middle. But you can start out saying, here's an amendment changing the price to the appraised value of 235. And the seller can say, I don't agree with that appraisal. It is very rare that you can get an appraiser to change their appraised value. You can try. You are way better off, especially on the listing side. It's oftentimes the listing agent's responsibility, or it's expected that they would provide good comparables, a list of updates, any important details about the property to justify the price. Not influencing the appraiser, but just giving them the good information that they'll need to decide the value. But if it comes back low, we're about at the point where we can't do much about it. Outside of starting the loan process over with a different lender, that's a whole nother thing. But most of the time you renegotiate the price. Oftentimes you'll come somewhere in the middle, and it all depends on your buyer's comfort level. And in some cases, it might mean they have to put more money into their down payment. So that's a big discussion to have, and it's one to include the lender on. But in general, appraisal contingency is a good idea to have. And if you do decide to take it out, make sure that your buyer understands the risks and make sure that the listing agent understands how that works. Not in a condescending way, but very often I have taken that out, or I have in the past, and the listing agent doesn't understand because they think an appraisal has to happen since there's financing. There's a little more to that. So in general, it's a good practice to include it. And again, that's looking at the purchase price. So it's just to kind of offer a safety net, especially in a time when people are offering $15,000, $20,000 over asking price. If they're nervous about that, this is a good reason to move forward aggressively, but know that they have a safety net, that if the appraisal comes in low, that they have the opportunity to renegotiate the price. The biggest hurdle is getting the offer accepted. Once you're in, then you might have to renegotiate based on appraisal. So it's something to refer to in that regard as well. Timeline for that, I typically match that up with the loan commitment time frame, or just slightly less, because when it comes to financing, you get the accepted offer to the lender. The first thing they do is order appraisal, or they might wait till after inspection. The appraisal report comes back, and you're probably a couple weeks in or so at that point. And then after that, the loan commitment comes. So it kind of lines up close to that time frame. And appraisers, as of a couple weeks ago, were very busy. So they weren't getting out there immediately necessarily, and the reports were taking a little bit longer They usually do. So busy time of year, maybe accommodate a little more time frame. Again, talk to the lender. Right to cure for that as well. So this was added in the new offer. More or less, I tell people this is the cool down time frame, the give a person a moment to think about it. So if we can't come to an agreement on a change of the price when it did appraise lower, if the seller says, I'm not changing anything, and the buyer says, forget you, I'm walking away, I'm not paying this for this house, it's kind of a backup for the seller to have a moment to say, actually, I thought about it, and I think we can move forward at the price you asked. We'll cure this by going to the appraised value. So that was built in to this offer. It's a newer part of the contingency. And within however many days, 5 days is a pretty good amount of time to hang out and wait for other offers and think about it. I usually shorten that up to maybe 3, 2. You want the seller to have some time to think about it and run numbers, but I try not to leave too much time, because then another offer could come in and then you're done. Also, you have to wait around for them to reply before you can really move on with that buyer and a new offer. So good to keep that in mind. Line 330, closing of buyer's property contingency. So that is if they have to sell in order to buy. So that's also known as the home sale contingency. So closing of buyer's property contingency is if they have to sell in order to buy. The house ideally that they're selling is on the market. And even more ideal is that it's on the market with an accepted offer. It's going to be a lot harder to get the seller to be okay with an offer with a home sale contingency when the house isn't even on the market, or it's on the market and has no offers. Think about it from their perspective and help your buyers understand being in their shoes as well. So whatever the case, you're going to check that box and put in the address of the home they're selling and the date by which they plan to sell. So again, if you have an accepted offer on the house they're selling, the closing date could go in there. And that's to ensure that the seller is aware of, the seller has that time frame. And if the house doesn't sell by that date, then you're beyond that deadline, and the seller could, well, as it says below, if the closing does not occur by the deadline, this offer shall become null and void, unless the buyer delivers to seller on or before the deadline reasonable written verification from a financial institution or third party in control of the buyer's funds that the buyer has at the time of verification sufficient funds to close, or proof of a bridge loan financing, along with written notice waiving this contingency. So delivery verification or proof of bridge loan shall not extend the closing date for this offer. So if you're getting the impression that the house they're trying to sell is not going to happen, it's good to be proactive, and find out if they have other options like a bridge loan, if you can get another buyer in there. If you have to extend the deadline of this and the sellers agree to it, talk to the listing agent. Communication is so important. Surprising the seller and their agent with, guess what? The deal fell apart on the house they're selling, and so it's due today, and so now we want to see if we can extend that date. Unless it's a surprise to you and you did everything in advance and you were keeping that listing agent in the loop, that's another story. But if something not so great's going on, it's best to figure out what's happening, come up with a solution, bring that solution to the listing agent. Don't wait until it blows up in your face and then go to them. It's not going to end well. Everybody's going to get emotional. So being proactive about that's really important. The bump clause after that is a really important bit, line 337. That used to be automatically part of the home sale contingency or the closing of buyer's property contingency. It is now a separate piece. And what that says is if the seller accepts a bona fide secondary offer, so it can't be like the listing agent writes another offer, it has to be from a legitimate buyer. The seller may give written notice to the buyer that another offer has been accepted. And that offer has been accepted as a secondary. So they're not just pushing out the buyer. However, the buyer, if they do not deliver to the seller the documentation listed below. So proof of bridge loan financing or proof of the ability to close from a financial institution without their home selling. Then lost my place. Then this offer shall be null and void. So the buyer must deliver the following: written waiver of closing of the buyer's property contingency, where they're taking that contingency out. Written waiver of other contingencies, might be financing, that's what it used to be. And then they have to provide this proof. So a seller likes a bump clause because it gives them the opportunity to go with a different offer. A buyer does not like a bump clause because if they have this home sale contingency, this property closing contingency, that means the seller can still collect secondary offers. It also means the listing in MLS does not say there's an accepted offer. So people can keep coming through and people can write offers and they can accept as many secondaries as they want, but they're in a waiting position unless they go back to the buyer and say, we have an accepted secondary, we want to bump you unless you remove this contingency and you have proof of this other financing. So it's a less sure situation for your buyer. It is a more comfortable position for your seller, but there's risk there. So you can try not including it. I used to actually strike this out when it was part of the contingency, and I got away with it more often than I thought I probably should, but it worked to my buyer's advantage. We did it, everything worked out. But just be aware of that. And if you're writing an offer with a home sale contingency and a bump clause, it's a little more complicated. So it's worth calling the hotline or checking this video again just to make sure you're comfortable with those pieces. Next, page 7. Is everybody awake still? I have like no video from anybody. Are you still there?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
I'm here.
It's dry. I know it's dry.
I'm good.
It's so important. I know it's dry. Okay, page 7, secondary offers. So if you know there's a home for sale that basically has this property sale contingency on it, they might put it in MLS. They might say, we do have an offer with a bump clause, or we have an offer with a home sale contingency. You would then be writing a secondary offer. Like I said, a seller can collect more than one secondary offer. It's not a guarantee that you're the next one in line. It just means you're on deck with maybe more than one offer. It's pretty uncommon that there's more than one secondary, but there could be. So if you're writing a secondary offer, you'd check that box. And the other piece of that on line 354 is how long your buyer is willing to be hanging out in that secondary position. The thing to consider is if you're in a secondary position, that could be even without a bump clause. If there's just a house they love and they have an accepted offer and the buyer's like, I don't want any other house, I want this house only, and I'm hoping that the deal they have right now doesn't work out, you can write a secondary offer. But they might want to limit how long they're waiting, because while they're waiting, they can't write an offer on anything else. So it's a tricky spot to be in unless they're really dedicated to this property. So that's why you put in the number of days until they're allowed to withdraw. 7 is what goes in there if it's left blank. Again, anything you're going to leave blank, fill it in intentionally, write in a number, even if it is 7. If you're not using this, put in NA, but give the amount of time that the buyer is willing to wait around and not be able to write an offer on anything else. They really love this place. And it's always best to call the agent who has the property listed, find out, how's that offer you have right now going? I have an interested buyer who might want to write a secondary. Is the seller open to secondary offers? Can we still look at the property? And, how far into the offer might they be? So you can check that date in MLS where it says when the offer was accepted or when it went active with offer or off contingent offer. So you can kind of get an idea. If you're around 14 days, you might be in the middle of inspection. So oftentimes if things are going to fall apart, that's when it happens. So you might still have an opportunity. If you're at like 45 days, they might be past the financing or there might be trouble. So the agent cannot tell you exactly what's in that offer they're working with, but they could give you some indication of whether there's a potential opportunity there. So when you're writing a secondary, it's good to have an idea of what's going on, set your buyer's expectations and make sure you have that time frame in there. Homeowners association, if there are fees associated with that, even if it's like a subdivision, that's what this is referring to, since there's a separate offer for condos. Closing prorations, this is at closing. Prior to closing, the seller and the buyer both get closing statements, and they basically are columns of credits and debits, and then at the bottom is the net proceeds, or the cash the seller gets at closing, and the total amount due, or the cash due at closing, from the buyer. And that's the check they bring, or the wire transfer. That includes their closing costs and their down payment. But there's some credits that they get. The seller, most typically, the seller will credit the buyer for the taxes, the property taxes, from January 1st to the day before closing. And that is very, very common. So they'll take the taxes from last year is most typical. So line 368, net general real estate taxes for the preceding year. And they'll divide it by 365. And then the number of days from January 1 to the day before closing, they multiply that, and that's the dollar amount that the seller is crediting the buyer. So they get that credit at closing. It might go into their escrow account with their lender so they can pay their taxes at the end of the year. So the lender's collecting every month the amount towards the taxes based on last year's taxes, plus a little extra just in case. And at the end of the year, they send a check either directly to the municipality or to the buyer, who then forwards it along to the municipality to pay their property taxes. It ensures for the lender, if they're escrowing, that the buyer isn't going to default on their taxes, which is a problem because the lender is involved in the ownership of the property. They have a lien on it. So when you're doing this, that is the most common way to go about it, is to ask for the credit from the seller for the net taxes from January 1 to the day before closing, and that gets credited at closing. There's some other creative ways, and the kind of high level, just like overview of when that might not be true is if it is a significantly improved property. Maybe they've added a level or some kind of addition. If they've done major improvements, it's very likely that the tax assessed value that's different from the appraised value, the tax assessed value will probably go up, and that means their taxes will go up. So if you think it's going to be significant, it may make sense to use one of these other options to figure out what the taxes, the tax credit should be from the seller. Or if it's a new build, you're looking at last year's taxes as vacant land versus a 4-bedroom house, you're going to see a significant increase in taxes, right? So it's good to just consider what you're working with and make sure your buyer understands what they're taking on. If the taxes for 2020 are higher, they might be responsible for a little bit additional because the credit was based on last year's taxes. So just good to keep that in mind when you're going through that with them. Evidence of title. I'm not going to get really into title just in the interest of time, but that is, the title is, the property is researched for liens and encumbrances by the title company of the seller, that the seller pays for, and they are looking for free and clear, no construction loan liens or mortgage loan liens on the property, and just making sure that your buyer is not acquiring a property that has liens attached to it and therefore debt that wasn't theirs, but it's attached to the property. And the gap is for the time frame between that gap endorsement, line 403, also very commonly paid for by the seller. It's usually around $175. So having that as the seller is most common, where you're striking out on line 403. That is just covering the time from when the title commitment is issued and the closing happens. So you should be getting that from the title company. You should also be getting the title research from the title company. So make sure that you are reviewing that. Make sure you're forwarding a copy to your buyer, that you're both checking to be sure that their names are spelled correctly, that the address is correct, that there's nothing in there that they're concerned about. And usually is best to connect them directly to the title representative to have their questions answered. And you should do the same. If you're not comfortable with title, talk to somebody in advance. Watch the video from when Jenny from Focus went over title in productivity coaching. I know we have that in the Facebook group. So make sure you're comfortable with that and read through it. I'm gonna skim down through page 8. So special assessments, if a special assessment was issued, work was begun prior to this offer, the seller is responsible to pay it. So like if you notice road work or sidewalks being torn up, stuff like that. If anything happens after the date of your offer, it's the buyer's responsibility. Now you could change this and say that it's up until the date of closing, it's the seller's responsibility, or a couple of days before closing to accommodate those closing statements. Have that discussion with your buyer and kind of be aware of what's going on with the property though. If it has a lease on it, if there are tenants, make sure you're including that as well. There's a bunch of definitions in here. It's good to go over those again in advance of writing the offer with your buyer. The property damage on page 9. So if something happens to the property that's less than 5% of the purchase price prior to closing, the sellers are responsible for repairing it to as good or better than it was the time of the offer. If something big happens, tree falls on the house, major storm, car crashes in the front door, something big that's more than 5% of the purchase price, then it is the seller's responsibility to send notice to the buyer that this happened. And that could mean that they are going to give the buyer their insurance claim proceeds. So they're going to make an insurance claim and their payment towards their insurance, or their payment on top of that. So that is something, if it happens, it's in here to protect your buyers in a freak accident situation. But you may need to work through that with their lender if the house requires some major repair. Pre-closing walkthrough, line 481, that happens within 3 days prior to closing. I usually recommend doing it at least the day before, if not 2 days before. Reason being, if you're checking repairs to make sure they were done and making sure that, you know, the things that are in the house are like packed up, it kind of looks like they're getting ready to go. If you notice anything the buyer for sure does not want, like old paint, that it gives the seller a chance to rectify that repair that wasn't done, get the paint out of the house, whatever it is. If you do it the day of closing, it's very rushed. You're pretty much just going to get the house as is, as your buyer sees it. So just make sure that you're doing that if you can, at least the day before. And that's about a half hour, 45 minutes, last chance to take measurements, last chance to check for any scratches, dings, any problems you didn't see before that may have happened during a move out. The seller does not have to be moved out of the property at this time. So if they still have stuff there, don't freak out. They can be there till closing day. So, but there should be some at least evidence they're moving, right? Occupancy of the property happens most commonly at closing. So the seller, or everybody signs the paperwork, your buyer gets the keys, they can occupy. There are exceptions to that, and you can fill out an addendum O to change that. Either let the seller stay after closing, kind of as a rent back, let the buyer move in prior to closing as a pre-closing occupancy. There's other options, but typically it's day of closing, they get the keys, they can move in. And believe it or not, buyers don't usually know that. So explain it to them. Even these simplest things, they don't necessarily know and they get nervous about, so make sure they're aware. Default, I'm going a little over time, I hope that's okay. Default, if the buyer walks away without using a contingency, and they just run for the hills, then the seller could sue them to move forward to closing, or they could keep their earnest money or sue them for actual damages. So like time off the market or expenses that they accrued with the purchase. The buyer, likewise, if the seller walks away not using basically the loan commitment, then the buyer could sue them for specific performance, which means move forward to closing or get their earnest money back, or also sue them for damages additionally. So like the cost of inspection would be a common one. So there's something in place in case people do breach contract. If you get to that point, this may be more of a attorney situation. So Make sure you're not giving legal advice. You're only referring to the way the offer is written and what's in there. If you're unsure, go to the hotline. Kimmy might be a good reference if you're not getting the information you need from launch coaches, but make sure that you're not giving legal advice in the event that happens. Hopefully it doesn't, but sometimes it does. And that does lead to a cancellation and mutual release to release the earnest money potentially. So we can talk more about that later. The FERPTA line 516, that's saying that the seller needs to provide this proof that they are, or this foreign status form. If you're unsure about that, it's in zip forms, and it's something that the seller fills out. It has their social security number on it, so they're sending it directly to the title company. So usually now title companies are providing a receipt. So you're just asking for a receipt from the listing agent to prove basically that that seller is showing that the seller is not a foreign entity or person or LLC, and that means they're going to pay these taxes at closing. Otherwise, a very large tax can fall on your buyer. So just make sure that you're getting that, and there's a deadline on there as well. So make sure you're collecting that and keeping track of that deadline. Page 10, any additional provisions or contingencies. If there's anything you struck out and need to reword, like the part about the special assessments, you would write that in here. You'd reference the line and you'd say what it's supposed to say, or you'd add whatever you need to add. Delivery, most commonly, so personal delivery, nobody does that anymore, but it's standard in the contract. Make sure you have the listing agent's name and your name in there. And then I usually only put email as the other. If you have US Mail or FedEx, theoretically, the other party could mail something to you and you would just have to wait until it arrived, and why? So most often you're not doing that unless you are in fact dealing with papers being mailed back and forth. So just confirm that with the listing agent. The listing and MLS will say if they have electronic consent or not, and that's where email may come into play, email signatures and timelines, keep in mind too. And then at the bottom, 563 addenda, the GMAR addendum A is most commonly included. It's automatically filled in on zip forms, but be sure it's there. That has additional contingencies for testing, well water, septic, etc. And it has the contact information for the listing agent and the buyer's agent. So it's good to include, even if nothing applies, fill out all the NAs in the boxes and make sure your buyer initials it. It shows they had the opportunity to use it and chose not to. It's just another professional, complete way to do the offer. So that is the offer document. Whew. How's everyone feel?
I'm good. My dog is asleep.
Awesome.
Just no interest.
So next week, I want to get back to a more interactive workshop. So thank you for sticking around and for coming today. I hope you got some good details. Again, go to the YouTube page to get a review of any of the videos that we've done. Any of the workshops we've done are on there. And next week, we're going to check in just to see how everyone's doing with their top 5. And I may be putting some things out on the Facebook group, just asking some questions, kind of getting you ready to talk more about that. So I look forward to connecting then. I'm continuing to make phone calls. If you haven't heard from me yet, I will be in touch within the next couple weeks, making phone calls every week to check in and see how you're doing. So I hope everyone is staying positive and focusing on at least one thing a week, blocking your time to work on that thing and celebrating those little victories. This is an awesome time to get through those top 5 while you've got a little more focused time to work on them. So thanks everybody for coming, and feel free to rewatch this on the YouTube page, and have an awesome day.
Thank you. Don't forget to vote.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.